Well, good morning there, Tubaneros. Another video on Islam in the West, as I don't believe I sufficiently addressed the West's responsibility in fostering militant Islam in my last one. First, let's get it straight from the get-go that I'm not an apologist for Islam. For those of you convinced I'm a Muzzy lover, come on, say it, you know you want to. In a theistic versus rationalist argument, I'd come down on the side of Hitchens or Dawkins, whether it involves a doctrinaire Christian, Jewish, or Muslim. It's when social and political issues are built upon singling out any one religious community as deserving of scapegoating, harassment, ridicule, or worse, that we diverge. And the issue of Islam versus the West has become, in my view, just that. I don't have to become an anti-Semitic bigot to express disagreement with Orthodox Judaism or Zionist philosophy or Israeli politics. My critique of those things would only be damaged if I did. But so many of the anti-Islam crowd have allowed themselves to degenerate into the equivalent of just that, or they're allowing themselves to be perceived as such. I recently saw a video of a seminar at the Amazing Meeting this July in Las Vegas, where Richard Dawkins and other fine panelists are discussing moderate Muslims who are afraid to condemn the fanatics who throw stones or bombs in their name as well. And a Muslim watching that video could well think, are you moderate Westerners condemning the fanatics in your midst, who burn mosques or drop cluster bombs from 30,000 feet in our societies? Are you taking pains to distinguish yourselves from your jihadi terrorists who will kill even your own people for not being militant enough, as per the tragedy in Oslo? Or are you merely serving as a cover, a front for intolerant fanatics with whom you secretly agree? If we have to spell out our dissent from the bombers and hate demagogues to you, then it's only fair that you do the same for us. That issue did not seem to be raised at the meeting, however, otherwise amazing, so I'll do it here. After the recent Norway terrorist attack and mass murder, immediately the so-called terrorism experts were looking for an Islamic connection, just as in Oklahoma City in 1995. Of course, it never occurred to them that there might be violence-loving elements in their own midst. No, not in our golden liberty-loving West of secular humanism and civil society and the rule of law. It must have been some immigrant fanatics who just don't understand our ways and values. And even after being proven absolutely wrong, the know-it-all counterterrorism pundits still won't admit they're wrong. Well, it just shows how the example of Al-Qaeda is spreading. The modus operandi seems identical to me to the killings of Columbine High School in 1999, which had nothing to do with Al-Qaeda either, or its example. In fact, the Oslo killer was associated with anti-Muslim groups, surprise, afraid that Sharia law will take over Europe. People very much like anti-Muslim jihadis like Pamela Geller or Bridget Gabriel in the U.S. With people like this feeling free to express their propaganda by the deed, the West doesn't need Sharia law to make a mockery of its pretensions to secular enlightenment. The truly ironic thing is that many opponents of radical Islam, who routinely palm off their own homegrown terrorism onto convenient scapegoats, played a role in fostering what they now claim to hate. I'm by no means the first one to point out the inconvenient truth that the West, and Israel, stoked Islamic clerics and political parties and even terrorist groups to counter the secular nationalist left and Arab nationalist movements in the Middle East. This went far beyond the usual example of funding bin Laden against the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Since no one is going to support the Soviet reasons for intervening in Afghanistan, though they're pretty much the same as Obama's, the support given the Afghan Mujahideen has been viewed as a good policy that went bad. To extend this further, the Muj of 1981 were good guys who somehow themselves went bad 20 years later. Of course, this is as much nonsense as any magic trick of the Quran, as the Muj themselves did not change any more than the West did. But the Afghan case was unusual only in that Islamic militants were employed against a real foreign infidel invader, instead of domestic enemies who were disfavored by the West. This was the primary pattern used against any native Middle Eastern state or leader threatening Western interests. Supporting militant Islam against a foreign invader like the USSR was very much the exception in the years after World War II. So, let's begin with Iran, of course. For 30 years, the U.S. has been fuming over the rise of radical Islam in that country and praying for democracy to take root there. There is, I believe, a virtual conspiracy in the Western media, not to inform its public, to any significant extent, that the rise of Islam as a political force was consciously fostered by Britain and the U.S. to counter the nationalist Premier Mossadegh when he tried nationalizing the Anglo-Persian Oil Company in the early 50s. It's admitted that the CIA and MI6 helped put the Shah securely on his throne and defeat Mossadegh, but Western pundits and analysts are still too shy to mention that it was Iran's Islamic establishment who helped the CIA coup makers by whipping up the crowds of extras in downtown Tehran that brought Mossadegh down, just as they would later bring down the Shah, and that the Cold War made the Shah, the Islamists, and the West allies of convenience at the expense of secular democracy in Iran, all to protect Western access to Iranian oil. Similarly, in the occupied Palestinian territories, where Hamas was courted by Israel as an acceptable alternative to Arafat and the secular PLO, as well as the more radical secular nationalists like Abu Nidal. Setting off traditionalists against secularists, dividing the Muslim world between radical anti-Western nationalism or anti-communist Islam, was the cornerstone of Middle East policy since the 1950s. Ironic, too, in that it was the English-speaking powers that originally whipped up Arab nationalism against the Ottoman Empire. Once again, former allies of convenience became enemies of expedience when fossil fuel reserves were at stake. Times have changed since Lawrence of Arabia. In Yemen, where Gamal Nasser of Egypt tried exporting his revolution through his armed forces in the 1960s, it was Britain and the U.S. that helped the Islamic resistance to Egypt's communist infidels. And of course, Yemen is now a hotbed of militant Islam and Al-Qaeda. Pakistan was also courted as a counterweight to the socialist USSR-leaning neutralism of India under Pandit Nehru. Like Saudi Arabia, it could do no political wrong because it was anti-leftist and therefore right. And like Saudi Arabia and Yemen, it too is a hotbed of U.S.-subsidized militant Islam. And then, of course, there's Bosnia, where Muslims were conveniently worthy victims when usable against the so-called anti-reform communist Slobo Milosevic, who was nothing of the kind. In the 1990s, the Muj and Al-Qaeda gained a Balkan foothold that was routinely dismissed in favor of human interest stories playing up rape camps, mass murders, and even genocide, relayed by so many of the same people who now rage against Islamofascism taking over Europe. The disconnect would be mind-boggling if one didn't keep in mind the political interest behind this disingenuous bait and switch. So, anyway, as we can see about the role of the West in fostering Islamic militancy, there is a lot of room for disingenuous hypocrisy. So, all right. Hello. Yes. Colonel Thomas C. Lawrence? Man, did you know you look just like the actor Peter O'Toole? Anyway, you just wanted to say that you think it's scandalous the way the West betrayed Osama bin Laden? Well, you know how that goes. One decade you're a freedom fighter against a common enemy, and the next you have Winston Churchill or George Bush dropping poison gas or depleted uranium on your ass. But you're not the only Westerner who forgot his helmet when butting heads with the Middle East.